Clara Mason was the quiet cashier everyone overlooked, and Daniel Mason was the reckless brother who couldn't stay out of the spotlight. Together, their names would unravel one of the most secretive Class A empires the UK had ever seen. What began with a supermarket shift and a few hidden crates grew into a criminal network powerful enough to rival gangs, until the smallest crack brought the entire empire crashing down. Clara Mason lived a life that seemed completely unremarkable. She was the type of person people barely noticed, the kind of woman who blended into the background of a busy supermarket. Every morning she walked to work, wearing the same navy uniform and carrying a simple bag. She scanned groceries, stocked shelves, and helped elderly customers with heavy shopping. To her colleagues, she was polite, hard-working, and a little reserved. She never gossiped much, never drew attention to herself, and always left on time. Nothing about her gave away that she was hiding a secret that could shock an entire city. The very ordinariness of her life was her greatest disguise. Her small terraced house added to the illusion. Neighbors thought of her as the quiet woman who paid bills on time and sometimes fed the stray cats outside. She never threw parties, never came home drunk, and never showed signs of reckless spending. When council workers or delivery drivers passed through her street, they couldn't have imagined that behind one of those tidy front doors was the nerve center of an empire moving thousands of pounds of Class A drugs every week. Clara had perfected the art of living in plain sight. The cover of her day job was more than just convenient, it was genius. In a world where drug dealers were often identified by flashy lifestyles, expensive cars, or suspicious unemployment, Clara's wages explained everything. When she deposited money into the bank, nobody questioned it. When she told friends she couldn't come out at night because of early shifts, they believed her. Even her manager at the supermarket saw her as reliable and loyal, someone who could be trusted with keys to the stockroom. The irony was that while she handled tins of beans and packets of cereal at work, she was also controlling the flow of cocaine and heroin across Liverpool after hours. The contrast between her two lives created a sense of safety for her. Police never looked twice at her. She didn't appear in intelligence reports, her name didn't feature in street surveillance, and her quiet routines made her invisible to suspicion. Clara carefully maintained this balance. She never missed a shift, even when she had been awake all night making decisions that could change the course of her business. She understood that the moment she slipped, the mask would fall. In the early days, her colleagues often joked about how she lived such a boring life. They teased her for not having social media, for not going out to clubs, for keeping to herself. Clara would smile faintly and laugh it off, secretly amused that the very things they mocked her for were the reasons she could run her operation unnoticed. The less anyone knew about her, the safer she was. It was a system of silence and control, and it worked perfectly. What nobody around her realized was that Clara's normal life was the most carefully built lie of all. Every customer she served, every smile she gave across the checkout, every mundane conversation about groceries, it was all part of a performance. The quiet woman stacking shelves was not just another worker earning minimum wage. She was already plotting, already growing, already building the foundation of an empire that would eventually shake the city. Her uniform wasn't just work clothing, it was the perfect camouflage. Clara's first step into the world she would one day control was not planned with grand ambition. It began with a single risk, a chance encounter that could have ended in disaster but instead opened the door to something far bigger than she ever imagined. Her cousin, recently released from prison, came back with contacts and stories of money made in the shadows. He returned not with shame but with opportunity, carrying a shipment of cocaine hidden in crates of imported fruit. For most people, the thought of touching something so dangerous would have been terrifying. For Clara it was different. She saw something more than just powder. She saw possibility. It was not greed that drew her in at first, but survival. Clara had grown up surrounded by financial struggle, scraping through life, with little to show for her hard work. The supermarket wages barely covered bills, and she had no savings, no safety net. The promise of money, quick and plentiful, was seductive. But more than that, Clara felt an instinct that she could handle it better than the men who stumbled through the trade. She was quiet, careful, and observant, qualities that made her invisible, and invisibility was priceless in the criminal world. The first deal was small. A few grams slipped into the hands of nightclub managers and bouncers who wanted something to sell to partygoers. Clara treated it like a business transaction, neat and controlled, making sure no one ever saw her as desperate or sloppy. Her cousin thought she would be frightened, but she was calm, almost cold in the way she moved the product. By the end of that first night, she had made more profit than 2 weeks of stacking shelves. It was enough to convince her that she was capable of something larger. What separated Clara from others was her discipline. She didn't indulge in the product, didn't flaunt the money, and didn't trust easily. She studied patterns of demand and supply like a student learning a subject. She realized quickly that the nightclub scene was fertile ground, a place where people wanted excess and would pay anything for it. Instead of scattering her product carelessly, she built relationships. To bouncers, bartenders, and managers, she was reliable, always delivering on time, never shorting them, never making excuses. Trust grew, and with it, her reputation. The money started to flow faster, and Clara learned to manage it carefully. She didn't rush into spending, though temptation was everywhere. Instead, she stored it away, saving for the future. While others might have celebrated their success with cars or jewelry, Clara used her supermarket job as a shield. She let people believe she was still poor, still struggling, still ordinary. It was the perfect way to avoid attention. But with every success came danger. There were moments when she wondered if the police were watching, or if a rival might notice her growing influence. Still, her quiet nature gave her an edge. She wasn't reckless like her cousin, or greedy like others in the game. She was measured, almost surgical, in how she moved. What began as a single risk, a few packages hidden inside fruit crates, was becoming the foundation of a larger vision. Clara realized she had stepped into something that couldn't be undone. The life of supermarket shifts and modest pay was no longer her only reality. She had discovered another world, one where power, money, and control could be hers if she had the courage to keep going. And she knew, deep down, that she did. Within 2 years, Clara had transformed what began as a handful of nightclub deals into a structured network that resembled a corporation more than a street operation. She understood from the start that chaos was the downfall of most drug gangs. They relied on fear, violence, and impulse, which inevitably drew police attention. Clara decided she would do it differently. Her empire would run on discipline, rules, and loyalty, things she had learned were essential during her years of working ordinary jobs. What others saw as menial routines in a supermarket, Clara saw as training. She understood the power of schedules, organization, and systems, and she applied those lessons to the underworld. Her first recruits were young men from struggling families, kids who had no prospects, no stable jobs, and no future beyond the gray streets they grew up on. She didn't choose them because they were tough. She chose them because they were desperate for a chance. Clara paid them better than any job they could have found elsewhere, and in return, she demanded strict obedience. They weren't allowed to question orders, and they weren't allowed to draw attention to themselves. She drilled them in silence, invisibility, and precision. Unlike the gangs that showed off with flashy cars and gold chains, Clara's runners blended into the background. They looked like delivery boys, construction workers, or university students. No one would suspect them, and that was the point. Clara established a set of rules that became the backbone of her operation. No one was allowed to sell on school grounds. No one was allowed to talk to strangers about business. No one was allowed to use the product themselves. Anyone who broke a rule was immediately cut off. No warnings, no second chances. These rules created a sense of order that separated her network from the reckless chaos of street crews. People who worked for her felt a strange sense of pride, as though they were part of something more sophisticated than the usual mess of crime. Clara made them feel valued, but also reminded them constantly that everything they had came from her, and it could be taken away at any moment. Her methodical approach quickly pushed her influence beyond the city center. She used her connections in nightclubs as the first stepping stone, then expanded to bars, festivals, and student parties. Word spread among those who mattered that Clara's supply was reliable, her product was consistent, and her network was trustworthy. Dealers from nearby towns began seeking her out, preferring her organized system over the unpredictability of local gangs. Without violence, without public displays of power, Clara was building an empire one step at a time. Police intelligence had no trace of her name. Surveillance units looked for noisy, aggressive figures who flaunted wealth, not a quiet woman who still worked her shifts at a supermarket. That was her greatest advantage. While rivals fought in alleyways and attracted headlines, Clara expanded silently, weaving her network through neighborhoods, roads, and borders like roots spreading underground. What she had created was not just a gang, it was a machine, built on strategy, discipline, and fear of disappointing her. Clara knew that with every new recruit and every new deal, she was securing her place as something rare in the criminal world, a leader who could hide in plain sight while controlling everything from the shadows. Every morning, Clara still rose before dawn and prepared herself for the supermarket shift. She walked through the aisles, wearing her uniform, scanning items at the checkout, and exchanging small talk with customers as though nothing unusual existed in her life. This routine was not a burden, but a shield. To outsiders, she appeared ordinary, almost boring, a woman content with the rhythm of work, wages, and home. That image kept suspicion away, even as her nights told a very different story. Behind the mask of normality, Clara was managing a flow of drugs, money, and people that stretched across multiple cities. The double life became her masterpiece. She made sure her colleagues saw her carrying packed lunches, complaining lightly about the cost of bills, and taking on extra shifts when asked. These little acts convinced everyone she was just another woman trying to make ends meet. Her modest terraced house reinforced the illusion. Curtains were always drawn at the same time, garden trimmed neatly, and no flashy cars parked outside. Clara lived in a world where appearances mattered more than words, and she maintained hers with ruthless attention to detail. Behind closed doors, the reality was starkly different. Her small home contained hidden compartments, stuffed with cash, coded notebooks recording every deal, and multiple burner phones that never stopped vibrating. Runners came and went discreetly, often dressed like delivery drivers or carrying shopping bags to disguise their visits. Clara orchestrated every movement with calm precision. Nothing was left to chance. She knew exactly how much product moved in a night, how much money returned, and which areas needed more supply. Her brain never rested, even when she smiled at customers buying milk or bread in the morning. What made her operation thrive was her ability to separate the two worlds. She never allowed her criminal identity to leak into her day job. No one at the supermarket ever saw her dressed in expensive clothes or flashing wealth. When rumors spread among workers about people winning money or getting bonuses, Clara would join in the small laughter, pretending her life was just as tight as theirs. This act of blending into the crowd gave her complete invisibility. Police often relied on spotting the odd one out, the person whose lifestyle didn't match their income. Clara made sure she never fit that profile. Yet this balance came at a cost. The strain of living two lives pressed heavily on her. Long nights blurred into early mornings, and exhaustion was constant. Sometimes she would stand behind the till, her eyes heavy, forcing herself to focus while her mind calculated shipments and payments. Every beep of the scanner was a reminder of how fragile her cover was. If she slipped, if she looked careless, questions could begin. But Clara's discipline held her together. She treated fatigue like an enemy to defeat, never showing weakness. Her neighbors thought of her as reliable, her colleagues called her dependable, and her family assumed she was modest and hardworking. None of them realized that beneath that surface was the architect of a growing empire. Clara understood better than anyone that her supermarket uniform was not just clothing. It was armor. The very thing that seemed to define her as ordinary was the reason she was extraordinary in the world she built after dark. It was the mask she wore so convincingly that even those closest to her never saw the truth. And that mask was the reason her empire continued to grow, hidden in plain sight. As Clara's network spread further, success began to draw the kind of attention she had always feared. Rivals once dismissive of the quiet woman in the supermarket now realized their profits were shrinking as her disciplined machine consumed the city's nightlife and student districts. Among them was a violent crew known as the Ashcroft Gang, a group that thrived on intimidation, chaos, and control. They noticed their usual buyers drifting away, preferring Clara's steady supply and consistent quality. For the Ashcroft Gang, reputation was everything, and losing ground to someone invisible felt like an insult they could not ignore. The first sign came quietly, like a shadow in the distance. A van parked outside Clara's terraced house late at night, its windows darkened. Hours later, flames lit up the street as the vehicle was set ablaze. Neighbors rushed out with buckets of water, thinking it was random vandalism. Clara stood among them, her face calm, pretending to be shocked like everyone else. She knew immediately it was a warning. Her anonymity was beginning to slip, and someone wanted her to feel fear. But Clara was not a woman easily rattled. Days later, another message arrived, harsher this time. One of her runners, a boy barely out of school, was attacked and left bleeding on the roadside. The assault was brutal, designed not just to hurt, but to send a message. Clara visited him in hospital, her expression blank, but inside she calculated every detail of the attack. She knew the Ashcroft Gang was behind it, and she also knew they expected her to step back, to shrink away from the streets they had ruled for years. Instead, Clara did the opposite. She expanded. Rather than slowing down, she reached further. Using her international contacts, Clara bypassed local suppliers and sourced product directly from overseas. It was a dangerous move, but it meant she could offer prices that no rival could match. Her network didn't just survive the pressure, it grew stronger under it. Dealers who once worked with the Ashcroft Gang quietly shifted allegiance, preferring the reliability and order Clara offered over the constant threat of violence. What the rivals thought would scare her into retreat only cemented her dominance. The Ashcroft crew tried to fight back with more intimidation. Cars followed her runners through dark streets, threats were whispered in pubs, and graffiti appeared on walls near her neighborhood. But Clara stayed untouched. She never carried drugs herself, never met buyers in person, and never revealed her movements. Her runners were trained to move like ghosts, blending in, slipping through the cracks unnoticed. By the time the Ashcrofts realized how far her influence had spread, it was already too late. What unsettled them most was her silence. Most gangs made their presence known with noise, violence, and spectacle. Clara's empire moved like an invisible tide, swallowing territory without anyone seeing it happen. The Ashcroft Gang had enemies they could fight, people they could threaten, names they could expose. But Clara was a shadow, a woman hiding behind a supermarket till, whose power was impossible to measure. Every attack against her seemed to vanish into nothing, while her empire only grew larger. For Clara, the threats became proof of her strength. She understood that, in the criminal world, fear was a weapon, but survival was won by intelligence. And while rivals burned vans and beat young runners, she was securing deals. For all of Clara's careful planning, her empire contained one flaw that she had overlooked from the beginning. Her younger brother, Daniel. She had brought him into her world not because he was skilled or disciplined, but because she trusted him. Trust, however, became her most dangerous weakness. Unlike Clara, who thrived in shadows and silence, Daniel loved attention. He enjoyed the sudden wealth her empire gave him, flashing it without thought for the dangers it attracted. At first, Clara excused his behavior. She told herself that he was just young, reckless, and would eventually learn the importance of discretion. But Daniel's habits only grew worse. He bought a bright sports car that roared through quiet streets, the kind of car nobody on their wages could afford. He wore heavy gold chains, expensive trainers, and designer clothes, all of which clashed against the modest life Clara had worked so hard to maintain. On nights out he threw cash across bars, showing off to strangers, ignoring Clara's constant warnings. The problem wasn't just his spending. Daniel loved social media. While Clara deliberately avoided it, he posted photos of himself holding drinks in luxury clubs, posing beside his new car and hinting at a life that didn't match his supposed employment. To friends, it was harmless fun. To investigators, it was the beginning of a trail. Surveillance officers didn't need to guess where the money was coming from. His lifestyle screamed of something illegal. They began to watch him, recording his movements, noting who he met, and slowly, step by step, those threads began to weave back toward Clara. Daniel's recklessness didn't stop there. He bragged to people he barely knew, boasting about how his sister was smarter than any man in the game, how she was the reason he had the life he lived. What he saw as pride was, in reality, betrayal. The more he spoke, the more whispers reached the ears of rivals and, eventually, law enforcement. Clara's empire, once untouchable, now had a weak link that was pulling it into the open. Clara noticed the changes around her. She saw unfamiliar cars parked at the ends of streets, noticed faces she didn't recognize lingering near her house. She realized she was being watched, though Daniel dismissed her concerns. He thought she was paranoid, convinced that nobody would dare touch them. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that the net was tightening with every careless move he made. Despite her frustration, Clara couldn't bring herself to cut him out. He was family, and loyalty to family had always been one of her strongest values. She told herself she could control him, hide his mistakes, and fix the damage he caused. But in truth, the trust she placed in Daniel became the crack in her empire's armor. No amount of discipline, planning, or invisibility could protect her from the danger he carried into their lives. For investigators, Daniel was the gift they needed. While Clara stayed silent, moved carefully, and left no obvious trace, Daniel gave them all the noise they required: his car, his clothes, his nightlife, and his online presence made him stand out like a beacon. All they had to do was follow him, and eventually, they would find her. Clara had built her empire on rules, order, and invisibility, but her brother lived by none of those principles. And as he flaunted the life she had created, he unknowingly pulled her into the light, the one place she had spent years avoiding. Her downfall had begun, not through rivals or mistakes of her own, but through the single person she had trusted most. It began before sunrise, on a morning that seemed no different from any other. Clara pulled on her supermarket uniform, tied her hair back neatly, and prepared to leave for another shift that would serve as the perfect mask for her true life. What she didn't know was that across the city, dozens of officers were already in position, waiting for the signal to bring her world crashing down. For weeks they had been building the case, piecing together surveillance reports, intercepted messages, and financial trails that all pointed back to the woman nobody had suspected. The quiet cashier who had lived among them undetected for years. The operation was large and carefully planned. Police raided multiple properties at once, striking at safe houses, storage units, and the homes of her runners. Clara's modest terraced house, which had once been her sanctuary of secrecy, became the center of the storm. At precisely 6 o'clock, the silence of the street was shattered by the crash of doors being broken open. Neighbors rushed to their windows, some barely awake, to see armed officers flooding the small home of the woman they thought they knew. Inside, Clara remained composed even as chaos erupted around her. Officers tore through rooms, ripping up floorboards, pulling books from shelves, and emptying wardrobes. They found what they were looking for. Hidden compartments revealed bundles of cash, wrapped tightly in elastic bands, coded notebooks filled with figures and initials, and burner phones that had been used to coordinate her empire. Every detail she had so carefully constructed in secrecy was laid bare within minutes. The walls she had built between her two lives collapsed in front of her eyes. Clara was handcuffed while still wearing her supermarket uniform. For the officers, it was a surreal moment. This quiet woman, who neighbors described as ordinary, was the mastermind of a Class A drug network worth millions. For Clara, there was no panic, no outburst, no visible fear. She walked out of the front door, calmly, ignoring the flashing cameras and the shocked expressions of her neighbors. She had always known that one day this might come, and she refused to let them see her break. The news spread quickly. By evening, headlines across the country carried the story of the so-called Drug Queenpin, the woman who built an empire behind the cover of a day job. Her colleagues at the supermarket were stunned, unable to believe that the quiet cashier who joked about food prices was also directing shipments of cocaine across multiple counties. For many, it was the betrayal of appearances that shocked them most. How someone who looked so ordinary could live a life so dangerous in secret. Police celebrated the operation as a major victory. Years of investigation into the city's drug trade had led to many arrests, but this one stood out. Clara's empire had been different from the loud, violent gangs they usually targeted. It was structured, disciplined, and hidden in ways they had never encountered before. Taking her down was not just about removing drugs from the streets, it was about proving that even the most invisible criminals could be uncovered. As Clara sat in a cell that night, stripped of her phones, her money, and her freedom, she thought not of the empire she had lost, but of how close she had come to perfecting the art of invisibility. She had built something extraordinary from nothing, and for years it had worked flawlessly. But all it had taken was a single crack in the mask, a single weakness, to expose the truth. And now, the double life she had lived so carefully was gone forever. The courtroom was filled with a strange mix of silence and tension as Clara Mason was led in for the first day of her trial. She wore plain clothes provided by the prison, a stark contrast to the neat supermarket uniform that had once disguised her other life. The woman who had seemed so ordinary to neighbors and colleagues was now painted by prosecutors as the mastermind of one of the most sophisticated drug operations the city had ever seen. Journalists scribbled notes, cameras waited outside the courthouse, and the public struggled to reconcile the two versions of Clara that now clashed in the open. The prosecution laid out their case piece by piece. They spoke of the coded ledgers found hidden in her home, the stacks of cash carefully concealed in floorboards, and the testimonies of runners who had worked under her. They showed photographs of burner phones, intercepted messages that linked her to shipments, and financial records that revealed sums no supermarket cashier could ever explain. The narrative was damning. Clara had not been a pawn, not a victim, but the architect of a Class A empire. Her defense team tried to soften her image, pointing to her day job, her quiet life, and the absence of direct evidence tying her to violence. They argued she was simply a woman who had been swept up in circumstances created by others, especially her cousin and her brother. But the weight of evidence was impossible to ignore. The coded notebooks alone spoke of organization and leadership, details too precise to belong to anyone but her. Through it all, Clara remained still. She listened, without emotion, her face unreadable. The same calm discipline that had carried her through years of double life now carried her through the trial. Reporters described her as cold, detached, even fearless. Some wondered if she felt regret. Others believed she was already planning her next move, even as her empire crumbled piece by piece in front of her. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. The judge, noting the scale and sophistication of her operation, sentenced her to a lengthy prison term. For most, it was the end of Clara Mason's story, the downfall of a woman who had hidden in plain sight for years. For others, it was only the beginning of a darker legend. Inside prison, Clara quickly became a figure of fascination. Inmates whispered that she still held influence, that her network continued to operate outside through trusted lieutenants. Rumors spread that coded messages were smuggled out, that orders still flowed from her cell in ways no guard could detect. Whether true or not, the belief itself kept her name alive on the streets. Rivals fought over the remains of her empire, but her shadow hung over them all. For her old colleagues at the supermarket, life returned to normal, but the memory lingered. They struggled to turn to how the woman who scanned their groceries and laughed quietly in the break room had built an empire worth millions. Neighbors, too, never looked at her house the same way again. It became a reminder that the most dangerous people were not always the loudest or the most visible. Sometimes they were the ones who blended in so well you never saw them coming. Clara's story became a warning repeated in documentaries and whispered in communities. Power often hides behind the most ordinary faces. She had fooled everyone, friends, family, neighbors, and even rivals, until the day her mask cracked. And though she sat behind bars, her name carried the weight of both fear and respect. The legacy she left behind was not just the empire she built, but the lesson she proved, that the quietest person in the room can sometimes be the most dangerous of them all.